Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's program, The Earliest Human Ancestors, part of our ongoing Hot Topic series. My name is Brianna Pobiner, and I'm a paleoanthropologist and educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Whether this is your first time joining us for a hot topic or you've attended before, we're so glad to have you here. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. This discussion offers closed captioning. You can turn them on or off via the CC button, which should be located at the bottom of the Zoom interface. As you have questions, please go ahead and submit them to the Q&A box, which is at the top or bottom of your screen, so we can sort through as many as possible. The Q&A really flies by. The Q&A box is also where we'll share any relevant links during the program, so keep an eye out there. We'll start with an opening presentation by our speaker, Dr. Ashley Hammond, and then I'll join her here to take your questions. And also, I want to wish everyone a happy Anthropology Day or Anthro Day today. So every third Thursday in February, which happens to be today, the American Anthropology Association celebrates Anthro Day by sharing the wonders of anthropology with the world around us. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Ashley Hammond is Assistant Curator of Biological Anthropology in the Division of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York and Assistant Professor in the Richard Gilder Graduate School. She works on the fossil record for ape and human evolution in East Africa. Her interests in human origins center on the evolution of locomotor behaviors, especially bipedal locomotion, which is the hallmark of the human lineage. She concentrates on the postcranium, especially the pelvis, as an indicator of locomotor evolution through time. In collaboration with researchers from the National Museums of Kenya, Dr. Hammond actively conducts paleontological research at several sites in Kenya. Her fieldwork has centered on the east side of Lake Turkana in Plio-Pleistocene hominin-bearing deposits that range from about 1 million years to nearly 4 million years in age. You can find a link to find out more about Ashley's research in the Q&A box. And now I'm excited to turn it over to Dr. Hammond to give us our hot topic presentation today.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, Brianna. Hello, everyone at home. My name is Ashley Hammond, and one thing that Brianna did not include in my introduction is that I am honored to also be a research associate at the Smithsonian. But as she said, my home base is at the American Museum of Natural History. And I am the biological anthropology curator at the museum. And more specifically, I am a paleoanthropologist. So that means that I work on the fossil record for ape and human evolution. Now, our knowledge about ape and human evolution is grounded in what we know about the living members of what is called the Hominoid Superfamily. Now, the living members include the living species of apes and humans. So this includes the lesser apes, which are gibbons and siamangs, great apes, so orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos, and of course, humans. Humans are also hominoids. And throughout this talk, I just want to point out, I'm going to use our recent snowboarding Olympic gold medal winner, Chloe Kim, as a representative of a human throughout my talk. Now, you've probably also heard the word hominins thrown around, and hominins are our branch of the family tree. So when you hear the word hominin in this talk today, I want you to immediately associate it with the human lineage. Okay, so hominins are species that are more closely related to us than to chimpanzees. Now, the most famous hominin, the one that is probably a household name at this point, is Lucy. Lucy is a 3.2 million-year-old hominin from Ethiopia. She's a female from a species called Australopithecus afarensis. So this is a pretty early hominin species. Now, I think it's important to remark upon what it is about humans that is so special, what's remarkable about humans, right? So we have relatively large brains, we make and use complex tools, we have symbolic culture, we interact cooperatively towards common tasks like sports, like Olympic sports, and we do really weird things like watch speakers over Zoom, right? But by and large, these are all very recent developments in our evolution. None of these things was present in the earliest hominins, not even big brains or complex culture, right? So what is it that makes the hominin lineage, not humans per se, but hominins, unique? So it's actually two things. It's canine reduction and habitual bipedality that seems to really define our clade. Now, canine reduction, if you look at a picture of an ape, or you can look at the picture that's on screen of the jaws of an ape, you can see that there's a really large upper canine in apes as compared to humans and hominins. And we're not sure exactly why canine reduction happens, but most researchers think that it probably indicates some kind of really profound behavioral shift associated with a reduction in male aggression. So the idea is that basically males are becoming less aggressive with each other in human evolution. But it's bipedality, so habitually walking upright on two legs, which really seems to be the hallmark of our lineage. Bipedality is what sets hominins on our own trajectory. So it changed how we move on the landscape. It makes our hands available for other kinds of tasks. And you could make the case that it's probably linked with all of those other things that make humans special. So things like big brains and culture and so forth. Now, what are the features that are associated with bipedality, the anatomical features? Well, we can look at Lucy species, for instance. So Lucy is Australopithecus afarensis, and we see bipedal features throughout the skeleton of Lucy's species. So we see a knee that is more positioned under the center of the body. This is called a bicondylar angle of the knee. We see a number of features of the pelvis, and I'll talk a bit more about these, but the pelvis has been completely reorganized in hominins. We see a fairly stiff foot with arches. The big toe is tucked in, and we also see a vertebral column that sits under the skull with curves that help balance the head over the pelvis, okay? Now, a big central question to hominin origins is why bipedalism arose in the first place. Why did bipedalism evolve in our early ancestors? And there's a lot of different theories. There's even more hypotheses than are on your screen right now. None of them on their own are entirely satisfactory though. And so there's no consensus about exactly what it was that was the motivation, what selective pressures really made bipedalism so advantageous for early hominins. But one thing that I think most of my colleagues and I are in agreement on is that it was probably a combination of factors. Okay, so it probably wasn't just one of these things, but it was probably several in combination. Now it seems that climate was probably a big part of the equation. So there was certainly increased aridity in Africa during the time when hominins first appeared. So this would have resulted in, patchy food resources. It would have required longer distance travel and locomotion between fruiting trees, for instance. So it probably is a combination of factors and in part related to the changing climate of the time. But as I said, this is not something that has been fully resolved. There's still an open question here. In terms of who the earliest hominins are, we have three really solid contenders. So we have Sahalaanthropus from Chad, Auroren from Kenya, and a couple species that are in a genus called Artipithecus from Ethiopia. So these are the three main contenders for early hominins. Now the oldest of these is Sahalaanthropus. This is the very earliest putative hominin. It's 7 million years old and from Chad. And Sahalaanthropus is thought to be an early hominin because the foramen magnum, which is the large opening on the underside of the skull, it's positioned in such a way that suggests that the head was situated directly over the vertebral column. Now you can tell from the picture on screen that this this cranium is not in the best of shape. There is some deformation. So we are currently awaiting the publication of postcranial elements that might reinforce that this was a bipedal hominin. But the preliminary evidence from the skull certainly suggests it's a hominin. The next of the very old hominin contenders is Aurorentus. This is a species that's about 6 million years old from Kenya, and it's known from an assortment of skeletal and dental elements. Critically, there are 3 femora or thigh bones that are preserved for this species, and the femur really has a shape that looks like it was a biped. So all lines of evidence suggest that this was a pretty early biped as well. And then lastly, we have Artipithecus. As I said, this was known from 2 species from Ethiopia. And the earlier species, Artipithecus cadava, is a little more fragmentary, but we have evidence of reduced canines in this species, as well as a toe bone that looks very hominin-like. But we have quite a lot of elements actually for the later species, Artipithecus ramidus, including a very, very nice skeleton that you can see on screen. And there's pretty good evidence for bipedality in this species. It seems that Artipithecus would have used a somewhat more transitional form of bipedalism. It has a toe that sticks out to the side like the living species of apes, and unlike our own. So it's probably doing some climbing, but it certainly has features that look like what we see in later hominins. And one part of the body that really shows bipedal signatures is the pelvis. So what you're looking at now is a picture of the Artipithecus pelvis. On the left-hand side, this is a cast of the fossil. And you can tell it's in kind of rough shape, but the discoverers of Artipithecus have been able to develop a reconstruction of what it would have looked like. And we can see a number of very interesting features in this pelvis. So among other features, hominin pelvis all share some very distinctive muscular attachment points. So these are in particular where the purple and orange arrows are indicating. These are some very important attachment sites for thigh muscles. We also see in hominins that the hip bone orientation changes a bit to facilitate bipedal walking. So I kind of describe this orientation as having hip bones that look more bowl-shaped, like an actual bowl that you would eat out of. And then hominins also have a short hip bone, at least as compared to something like a chimpanzee or gorilla, which tend to have very long hip bones. So the Artipithecus pelvis seems to have all of these key features as well as others. We can feel pretty confident saying that for sure we had bipedal hominins on the landscape in Africa by about 4.5 million years ago. Now, I'd like to just take a moment and contextualize these 3 earliest hominin contenders alongside some key landmark events in ape and human evolution. So I guess on this slide, the first thing to be aware of is the scale during which ape and human evolution is taking place. So on the timeline, the x-axis, if you will, we have millions of years. Okay, so we're showing 30 million years ago up until present. And we can even add in geological time periods. So these might be names that you're familiar with already. So in particular, here we're interested in the Miocene, Pliocene, and Pleistocene. Okay, so apes are estimated to have evolved actually quite a long time ago, 25 million years ago, more or less. The last common ancestor of the chimpanzee and hominin lineages, though, is estimated to have lived quite a bit more recently, at about 7 million years ago. Okay, so 7 million years ago would place the last common ancestor of the chimpanzee and hominin lineages in this time period called the Miocene. Okay, so that's being represented by the purple on screen. Now, our three early hominin contenders do indeed come from this time period in the latest Miocene, okay? The earliest hominins are appearing 7, 6, and 5.8 million years ago, okay? But this early record for hominins is actually quite sparse, right? We just have these three contenders at that time period. And the hominin fossil record gets really rich shortly thereafter. So it's starting with Australopithecus that we see a lot of species appear. Australopithecus is then sort of rapidly followed by genus Homo. And then the bulk of the hominin fossil record that we know of is coming from these later time periods. Okay, so the Pliocene and Pleistocene. In terms of a geological scale, the Pliocene and Pleistocene are actually fairly recent. Okay, these are fairly recent times. But it's important, I think, one thing that I really want everyone who's attending this talk today to leave the talk aware of. We cannot lose sight of the fact that hominins evolved from some extinct species of fossil ape, okay? And the fossil ape record is really, really rich and really diverse during the Miocene period, okay? There were probably more than 100 species of ape alive during the Miocene. And the fossil record for apes tapers off right around the same time that hominins appear. Probably the changing environment, the increased aridity in Africa probably made the environment less hospitable for apes during that time period. But the Miocene is when apes ruled. Okay, so you can kind of consider the Miocene to be the planet of the apes. Now, if we look at the living hominoids, there's a certain picture that emerges. Okay, so the living species of apes all use four-limb dominated locomotor behaviors. Okay, so orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, they're all climbing, some of them swing and suspend below branch. They're all using locomotion in the trees where they are primarily being propelled by their arms. Humans are the odd ones of the group. You know, we don't climb in trees. We're using bipedal locomotor behaviors. And there are also some other, remarkable things about humans that we've already discussed, right? Things like really absolutely large brains. But when we consider the data that are offered through fossils, especially fossil apes, we see that the living species of hominoids that are alive today are really just a brief snapshot into what was really a very large, morphologically diverse group. So all of the species of apes and humans that are alive today were just a relic of a really large, complex group. And this is particularly true when we look at locomotor behaviors. Fossil apes are really not well represented by the behaviors of the living species. There were fossil apes that, moved quadrupedally, more like a monkey. There were fossil apes that did all kinds of different locomotor behaviors today, or locomotor behaviors that are not reflected by any of the primates that are alive today. So a key takeaway from my talk is that considering fossil apes really is absolutely essential for understanding hominin origins. We cannot understand hominin origins and origins of bipedality if we don't consider also the group from which hominins evolved. Now, a big obstacle that paleoanthropologists are facing, though, is that there are almost no fossil apes from the latest Miocene in Africa. So if you look at this map, living apes today, they are found in tropical forests around the equator. So for instance, if you look at our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, these are found in equatorial forests in Africa. You can see they're indicated by the shaded green and blue areas on this map. Okay, so they are really localized around the equator in forests. Fossil apes, though, are indicated by these red stars, and they were much more broadly distributed. They were living in much more varied ecosystems. And, of course, not just in Africa, they were living in very diverse ecosystems in Eurasia as well. So the big challenge that paleoanthropologists face is that there isn't really a fossil record in the locations where living species of apes exist today, right? So there aren't fossil localities that are in equatorial Africa where modern chimpanzees live. And the fossil sites that are in Africa are almost entirely from the early and middle Miocene. So this is long before the last common ancestor of chimps and hominins. This was long before hominins appeared. We just don't have the picture from the paleontology of what was happening in the latest Miocene for apes. So we have this huge gap in our knowledge about what apes look like on the African continent leading up to the origins of bipedality. Now, in my description for this talk, in the advertisement, I posed the question, was the ancestor of hominins chimp-like in its anatomy? And this gets to an even bigger question beyond whether or not the ancestor was chimp-like. What do we really know about the anatomy of the earliest hominins? And this is a big unknown. As I said, the paleontological record is kind of missing during this time period. But I think another issue, a barrier, is our own thinking about the topic. So while it is widely recognized that hominins have been evolving for 6 or 7 million years, the chimpanzee lineage has also been evolving for 6 or 7 million years. So it's unlikely that if we went back 6 million years in time, that the ancestors of chimpanzees would have looked exactly like a living chimpanzee. So it's, part of the issue, what I'm getting at is that part of the issue is our own thinking about the problem. We can't use modern chimpanzees as an exact representation of what the ancestor of humans would have looked like. So while we don't have the fossil record for the ape ancestor of hominins, this is a place where we need to do more work. So looking to the future, looking forward, I think that continued paleontological work in Africa is really the key to solving this problem. So ideally, we need to locate and work fossil sites in Africa that are between about 5 and 9 million years old. And if we could find any ape or hominin from this time period, it could really be transformative in our thinking and our models for hominin origins. So right now we are at this point in time where we just don't have enough data to fully flesh out exactly what kind of ape hominins evolved from. And the pictures I'm showing you on screen are from a couple of sites that I've been involved in the field work. So in southern Kenya, I've led fieldwork to a 6 million year old site, or a couple of sites in the southern Kenyan Rift. So that's the picture that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. And in central Kenya, I've been a participant in fieldwork led by some of my Japanese colleagues at a 9 million year old site. So in both instances, these were really important field projects to better understand the environment during which early hominins would have been encountering, and also providing new fossils relevant to the question. And I would also like to say that these were collaborative field projects with the National Museums of Kenya. And I think that's a really nice segue into acknowledgements. I would first and foremost like to thank my colleagues at the National Museums of Kenya They are absolutely essential to all of the field research that we do on the ground. And of course, I would also like to thank the people and government of Kenya, where I conduct field work, and other colleagues and granting foundations that have made my work possible. And with that, I am very excited to move on to the Q&A and discuss with Brianna and answer any questions you guys might have. As you can see, there's a lot of questions that still remain open.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hammond. That was wonderful. And we already have several questions in the Q&A. So, but before we jump in, I first want to give you a compliment that came in through the Q&A. Christine says, I just wanted to say the visuals, maps, trees, skeletal representations, etc. of this presentation are great. They're so well done and helpful in understanding the content. I agree.
Thank you. Hopefully, in many cases, I tried to remember to link if it came from a publication so that you can reference those publications and use the imagery for your own purposes for, classroom presentations and so forth.
Thank you. So we had a couple of questions since you had mentioned about canine teeth. So one question that came in, could a reduction from an anonymous attendee, could a reduction in canine size over time also be associated with more reliance on hunting tools to kill prey rather than canine teeth?
Could be. So canines tend to be more important for hunting in carnivores. But even within carnivores, the canines are not, they're kind of delicate teeth. And so in an effort to protect them, and Brianna can speak to this even more than I can because she works on carnivore modified bones. But canine teeth, I think you want to protect them so they don't fracture. So, we think of these carnivores that had really massive canines like the saber-tooth cats, right? And I think most ideas currently are that they weren't using those canines to, rip into their prey for chewing purposes. Maybe it was to just get them down initially. As far as within primates, we don't see very many primates hunting and using their canines to sort of obliterate their prey. So chimpanzees do a lot of hunting, more than I think had been recognized, 50 years ago. They do a lot of group hunting of especially colobus monkeys, seem to be their preferred dessert item. But from what I recall, there's not much involvement of the canine teeth in those activities. So if we were looking to the living species as a modern analog or a model, we're not seeing anything there, I think. But it's wonderful.
And my understanding is that canine size is really can be more interpreted about sort of social behavior rather than dietary behavior. So I have a question that's kind of related to that from Ralph. Did the reduction in canine size coincide with a reduction in sexual dimorphism?
So I suppose it depends on what you mean by sexual dimorphism. So we see dimorphism in canines and we see dimorphism in body size. And both are tied to aspects of social structure usually, right? The two are not necessarily coupled. For most primates, they are. So for most primates, you tend to have big canines if you also have dimorphic body sizes. But in the case of early hominins, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that the males were still bigger in body size than the females. And both males and females had reductions in canine size. So it's whatever is happening in early hominins is a little unusual.
Interesting. All right, I'm going to switch to a different part of the body. So here's a question from Richard. Was childbirth easier in earlier hominin deliveries?
Well, hard to know, but I think most of our estimates say it was a little easier. So there have been some folks who have looked at trying to model the obstetric canal, size in different hominins. A big piece of the equation is also the size of the neonate or the baby that would be passing through the birth canal. And at least in early hominins, the brain size, the neonate size was still, it seems to be pretty manageable for passing through the birth canal. It seems that it's in our genus Homo, where the brain size gets much bigger, that the passage of the infant becomes much more complicated, and it requires a lot of maneuvering through the birth canal.
Great. We're going to have a locomotion question now, and this is from Urate. Could you comment on the idea that the common ancestor of chimps and hominins was more upright rather than walking like modern chimps?
Sure. So one thing, so as you probably took away from my talk, is that we are still a little unsure about exactly what kind of an ape hominins evolved from. So that's a big question mark. But there are fossil apes from the later Miocene in Europe, especially. And the fossil apes from Europe are a little bit more, what I'm going to call it, generalized. They're not quite as derived looking as a chimpanzee or a gorilla. They look a little more primitive, and their whole body plan would probably have been a little more flexible and easy. It would have been easier for them to stand up and posture bipedally than it is for a chimpanzee. Chimpanzees have a really stiff lower back, a really long pelvis. They have all these features that are really advantageous for climbing, but it makes them not very good bipeds. And a lot of the apes that were alive, at least outside of Africa during the later Miocene, were a little more flexible. So it's very possible that we evolved from something that was a little more generalized like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here's an interesting sort of taxonomy question from Brighton, who asks, is there a primary criterion for recognizing a hominin or ape genus as opposed to a species in the fossil record?
Oof, this is a tough one. This is I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer for you, Brighton. Often this depends on how radically different the remains appear to be. If they look pretty similar to something we already have, there's a good chance that they will get placed within at least an existing genus. When they start to have some nuanced characters, especially if we have multiple individuals of this new species or new discovery, then they are often allocated into a new species based on at least one distinctive character. But this is a very difficult question for folks in paleoanthropology.
Yeah, I agree. That's a tricky one. Here's a question about fieldwork. So Maria asks, how do you choose a place to start searching for fossils?
So it's a combination of things, I would say. The way that most of us decide where to do field work is, I think, just being in communicate. It's word of mouth, really. Hearing that there may be fossil exposures in a particular location, or that some fossils have come out of the ground in a particular location. So I think that's, in practical terms, how a lot of us go about it. But what is really essential is having a really excellent geologist working with you, and have them work with you to confirm exactly the age and nature of the deposits before you invest in a huge field campaign. So if I think there's like one really important key to doing field work is having a really good geologist on your side.
I agree with that one for sure. So here's a question from Steve. What does stable isotope studies show us about the vegetational change to C4 grasses over time in Eastern Africa? And does this support the savannah hypothesis of bipedalism and other adaptive responses in human specializations?
So the isotopic work that's come out, and I'm probably already behind on, there's an isotope paper that comes out almost weekly with updates on this. But the isotopic work that's been published in the last few years is showing that it's getting more arid in Africa even earlier and earlier than maybe we had originally thought. Now, whether or not, and so associated with that is that there would be more grassy environments opening up, things becoming more patchy between forested locations. Now, as far as whether or not the savannah hypothesis holds up, I think it's going to depend. And I think the isotopic data are pushing aridity earlier and earlier in time. So I think there have even been isotope dates as early as like 9 million years old showing it's already getting kind of arid. So I'm not sure. It's possible that there are parts of Eastern Africa where it's already getting pretty arid pretty early.
Here's a really interesting question, also sort of field work related from Amy. What's the general feeling in your field in terms of confidence in how well the fossil landscape is sampled for hominins and related groups?
So I think we're pretty confident about the later hominin record, particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa. We have actually quite a lot of fossils, thousands of fossils from Eastern and Southern Africa. Where we are poorly sampled is in Western Africa and Northern Africa. We have very few fossils from pretty much any time period. And when it comes to early hominins, so the later Miocene, I think everyone agrees that it is very, very poorly sampled.
Here's a specific sort of morphology question from Chris. With the abducted hallux of Artipithecus ramidus and other arboreal features, curved phalanges, etc., coupled with bipedal elements, how likely is it that bipedality could have evolved in trees with apes walking along branches using their upper limbs for support?
Yeah, it's a plausible explanation. So what's, I think, really surprising to me about Artipithecus ramidus is it's a pretty big individual. So this is a pretty large early hominin, and it's really challenging to imagine an individual this large walking on tops of tree branches and being steady. But it seems like she was up there in the trees. She certainly was climbing. She was living in a forested environment, and she had adaptations for being bipedal. So it's very possible she was bipedal while in the trees. I think, if only we had a time machine, we would know more about her locomotion and how it evolved.
I feel like I say that more and more these days about, if we had a time machine, we'd be able to figure out X, Y, Z.
Unfortunately, the more you know, I feel like the more questions are opened, and it feels like the less we know.
It's true. Once you sort of, fill something in, then you get more questions. Absolutely. So here's an interesting question about a totally different technique. Simon asks, it seems like a lot of paleoanthropological research today is also using genomic methods. Does that kind of research intersect with your research? And if so, how?
So the majority of the fossils that I work on are a little too old for genomic techniques to really be effective. So DNA degrades. It's a biomolecule. So over time, there's just a certain lifespan for DNA. And when we're talking about things that are 4, 5, 6 million years old and older, it very at least with methods as we know today, it's beyond the range of capturing DNA. A new technique that's come out in the last decade is looking at proteomics rather than genomics. So looking at protein structure in enamel, and with proteomics, we can get back further in time, but exactly how far back it'll go is a little unclear. And you get less taxonomic information about the individual sampled. There's fewer data points than you get in a genomic analysis. So proteomics might be possible.
But genomics probably not that far
For
back.
what I work on,
Yeah.
probably not, but genomics really is revolutionizing the more recent hominin fossil record. I mean, we've got so much that we've learned about hominin taxonomy, behaviors, interbreeding. I mean, we even have a hominin species now that we know pretty much just from DNA, the Denisovans. We have a couple fossils, but I mean, it's incredible what we have today from genomics as compared to 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you that it has revolutionized our field and helped us to try to maybe tease out some of these relationships when we have fewer fossil remains. So here's a pointed question from Aishwarya. Is Sahalanthropus a hominin or just another fossil ape?
So good question. Based on, the foramen magnum position, it looks like it was doing some upright posturing. As far as whether or not it was a hominin or another ape, I think the jury's still out. We still need more data there. It would certainly be a very early hominin, so it probably does retain some features that obfuscate the relationship it has. But we do know that there are some postcranial elements for Sahalaanthropus. So I think we're all sort of waiting with bated breath to see those published, because that will give us more information. It may not resolve whether or not it was a hominin, but it will certainly give us more information about the kind of locomotor behavior that it would have used.
So speaking of Sahalanthropus and the other two earliest hominins you mentioned, Mara has a question. Of the 3 earliest hominins you mentioned, what features would lead you to believe they're direct human ancestors or just offshoots? And she says, great talk, by the way.
Thank you, Mara. I think with the earliest record, we may never have that nail in the coffin that links it to our lineage. So unfortunately, I think this is an unanswerable question, but my bent is I'm very locomotor focused. So I always am sort of fixated on the signals for bipedalism. But I should also give equal weighting to the canine reduction. Sure.
So here's a question from Austin, who says, thanks for a great talk, Dr. Hammond. What do you think are the most important tools or advancements for us moving forward in the study of human origins? Big question.
Oof. I do hate to say this, but I think genomics is going to be one of the absolute most important advances. It's not something that I do or really will probably solve the issues with the fossils I work on. But there's a lot of, we're getting better and better at quantifying morphologies, and I think there's a lot of promising advances out there. So some of my colleagues have recently been looking at using 3D shape data to try and reconstruct phylogeny. I think that has a lot of promise. But I think certainly a big chunk of the future advances is going to come from proteomics and genomics.
And let's see if we can, maybe it'll get usable older in time. That would be exciting.
The absolute best advances, I think, would be really great new fossils. Which
yes,
is why fieldwork is so important.
Absolutely. And I'll probably, I'll ask another question about your fieldwork in a bit. So here's a question. It's outside of your main area of expertise, but it's an interesting question. Hari asks, on brain development, do we know how long it took for babies' brains to fully develop after birth 6 million years ago versus now?
So that's a good question. There are people who look at different aspects of development. So, brain size, the growth of teeth, for instance, is very well understood. And they've tried to link some of these developmental milestones that we see in living species of primates and humans to what we're seeing in the fossils. And it does look like, at least at the early end of the human lineage, they were still developing in a more ape-like fashion. Their development was different from our own. So humans are we have a very unique life history. Our dental eruption patterns are very different. A very strange thing for humans is that human children will chew food for several years on their deciduous teeth, their baby teeth. And that's unusual for primates. Most primates have a closer linkage between tooth eruption and weaning times. And certainly modern humans have tremendous brain growth in the first 4 or 5 years of life. So, it looks like at the early end of things, hominins were developing more similar to what we see in apes than modern humans.
Here's a question, another maybe difficult or impossible to answer question from Kevin. The social differences between bonobos and chimpanzees is rather remarkable. Can fossils shed any light on these differences throughout time, or is that likely to remain unknown?
That's a good question, and it's not one that I've considered before. I suspect it's going to remain unknown. But what do you think, Brianna?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess maybe with, we were talking before about changes in sexual dimorphism, and maybe that has something to do with kind of social interaction. But again, I think those are the sort of once removed sorts of things that we would really like to know, that it's sometimes difficult to tease out with bony remains.
Well, and I think about, when we're working with fossils, we are really limited to just the bony anatomy, bone and teeth, right? And even though chimpanzees and bonobos have such dramatically different social behaviors, skeletally, they're pretty similar. Bonobos are a little smaller and a little more gracile in certain ways, but very, very similar. So you wouldn't necessarily see those differences in the fossil record and immediately jump to the conclusion that it's social behavior. So I don't know, this may be something that we're just never able to really answer.
Yeah, I agree that it probably falls into that category. So here's a specific anatomy or morphology question from Stephen. Did the size or shape of the sacroiliac joint change as the pelvis changed with bipedalism?
It does. So the most obvious change is that the joint, so Steve is referencing the location where the sacrum meets the ilium. Okay, so this is where the vertebral column and the pelvis are basically in contact. Okay, that's the way to think of it. The joint itself becomes much larger. Like in humans, it's a very large articular surface as compared to early hominins and even early genus Homo. So for instance, if you were to look at the Nariokotomi boy, which is a 1.5 million year old Homo erectus individual from Kenya, the joint in that individual is also kind of small compared to our own. The shape does change, so it is a little more elongate in early hominins, and it becomes sort of more squat and broad and large in later hominins. So good question. A lot of it is shape and in combination with size.
Nice, thank you. Here's another maybe a tough question to answer from Niels. Did hominin evolution speed up during the late Miocene and Pliocene, or do we just not have enough evidence to know?
That's an interesting question. So the fossil record at the very early end, again, is paltry. So we don't have very much information about what's going on there. Certainly, once we hit Australopithecus, we do seem to have this almost like explosion of different species that hits the landscape. So it does seem like there is some diversification, heavy diversification starting in Australopithecus. But as far as whether or not that reflects that it's sped up, it's hard to know. They may have just been moving into new environments or places where they were more likely to be preserved. So again, another unanswerable question.
We get a lot of these on these events. So yeah, it's great questions from people. Here's another interesting one from Mike, who says, the evolution of pre-Homo and Homo groups seem to proceed independently and in overlapping chronologies. Do you think it's possible to theorize a missing link between the fossilized apes and pre-Homo species, or is that even necessary?
Yeah, so the question is, find the link between pre-Homo and Homo.
I think so, yeah. He says, is it possible to theorize a missing link between fossilized apes and pre-Homo species?
Fossilized ape and pre-Homo. So things like these earliest hominins.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so, it would be, I'm not sure that we will ever find the key fossils that are the quote unquote missing link, the last common ancestor. And even if we did, we may not recognize them as such, potentially. We could, there are approaches that colleagues and I have undertaken to try and model what that potential ancestor would look like under different scenarios. So that's one way that we might develop hypotheses, at least of what the anatomy looked like under different scenarios. But I'm not sure that we will ever find, unfortunately, the fossil that fills in that gap.
Here's an interesting question that it may be more for people who study modern or living primates. So Jack says, you mentioned bipedalism may have arisen from a change in climate. Have you seen modern apes change their locomotion in response to recent droughts or changes in habitats or landscapes to support this?
No, but well, so first of all, I'm not a primate ecologist, so I don't spend time with living primates typically. But, we're also, we've been observing primates on a relatively short time scale, really just intensive field work with primates has been going on for the last 50 years. So, and very few populations have really been habituated and had researchers continuously monitor them. So that could be one limitation. But I think another, maybe even bigger limitation here is that the living species of apes as I said in my talk, are probably just these highly derived relics of a much more diverse group. And I think the reason why the living species are alive today is because they are so specialized for the forest that they live in, that in many ways they would not survive outside of those environments. So the specialization trap that living apes are in may actually contribute to their inflexibility and maybe their ultimate downfall.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Rick Potts
yeah.
of the Smithsonian has contributed quite a lot to that idea, actually. I can't take credit for that.
Thank you. So here's a sort of a geology question, as I would interpret it maybe. Kathleen asks, is part of the reason for the fossil record gap due to climate and soil types in equatorial Africa?
Very likely. So, I think it's very possible that the ancestor of early hominins was living in a more forested environment where we just didn't have the deposition that is needed. I mean, to create fossils, you really need a dead organism to get covered up, usually by water that brings sediments and covers it up and preserves it. And in forest environments, dead animals tend to just get eaten up by the ecosystem really fast, and they don't get covered up and deposited. And then even if they are interred, they are hundreds and hundreds of meters below the surface where you would need them to be to find them. So I think it's probably a combination of things, but yes, I think animals that are living in the rainforest or tropical forest period are very unlikely to get preserved.
Yeah, thank you. Here's an fun and optimistic question from Jay. What are you most excited about upcoming in your field and work?
So for me, I'm very excited to get back out and do field work after this COVID hiatus. So one of the last slides that I showed was included a picture of a field site in southern Kenya that's about 6 million years old. And I'm really looking forward to getting out with my colleagues again and working at that site, because 6 million years old is really prime time for when we think earliest hominins were appearing. And as I said, any ape or hominin from that time period could really transform how we think about, hominin origins. So I'm really looking forward to getting out to that site. It's very fossil rich. We did one season in 2019. We didn't find any apes or hominins, but we need to get back out and do a more intensive survey.
Hopefully,
so that's what I'm most excited for.
Excellent. So I think this will be the last question because we're running out of time, and I apologize for the many people whose questions we didn't get a chance to answer. But since we've been talking about time machines, I really like this question from Chris, who says, slightly juvenile question, although I think it's a great one. If you could travel back in time to observe only one fossil species while it was living, which would you choose?
Well, I would really love to go back and see something that's right around the time of the last common ancestor. I think for me, I would really love to go see the Auroren species. So I think that is a fossil that looks like it was using bipedal behaviors at about 6 million years, and probably a slightly different kind of bipedalism than we use. So I'd really love to just go see what they're doing, how they're moving through the trees or the forest landscape. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
What about you, Brianna? I think that's an important question.
Oh, for me, it would absolutely be Homo erectus. I think it was such a long-lived species and ventured across continents. And since I'm interested in dietary behavior, we do see some interesting evidence of meat eating with Homo erectus. So that would be my pick.
Mm-hmm. Good pick.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to wrap things up. And conclude today's virtual program. Please join me, everyone, in thanking Ashley for sharing her work with us. And I'd also like to give special thanks to those who made this program possible, to our behind the scenes team who helped sort through your questions, to our donors, volunteers, and viewers like you. And finally, to all our partners who help us reach, educate, and empower millions of people around the world today and every day. Thank you. I hope you'll join us for our Hot Topic program next month on Thursday, March 17th at 11:30 a.m. with Dr. Ellery Fromm from Yale University on ancient pyrotechnology, the role of fire in human evolution. We've put a link in the Q&A where you can find information about our upcoming programs and how to sign up for the museum's weekly e-newsletter. That's really the best way to stay informed on upcoming programs and learn more about the museum's research and exhibitions. After this webinar ends in a moment, you'll see a survey pop up asking for some feedback about the program. Please take a moment to respond. We're very curious to know what topics you might be interested in seeing for future programs, and we appreciate your input. Again, thanks to our participants, to the audience, and particularly to Dr. Hammond for this really interesting presentation. See you next month.